All right, welcome back. I'm Austin Westfall. Let's get to something that Secretary Rubio is going to be facing in the immediate term. Is this bizarre story out of Cuba? Cuba's Coast Guard shooting and killing 4 people, wounding 6 others aboard a U.S.-registered speedboat in an exchange of fire off the island's coast. That's according to the Interior Ministry of Cuba. They said that earlier today. In a statement, the ministry said that a Cuban patrol vessel had approached the Florida-registered boat to identify those on board when shots were fired from the boat, wounding the captain of the Cuban craft. Now we're getting this from the Associated Press, just sending this out within the past hour or two, saying Cuba says that the boat that opened fire was carrying Cubans living in the U.S. trying to infiltrate the island and unleash terrorism. Let's bring in a guy who knows a thing or two about strategic risk relating to terrorism, and really, Hal has covered lots and lots of stories with us here on air having to do with the Caribbean in recent months. We've been eyeing just the area off the coast of Venezuela. After the U.S. nabbed Maduro, we've kind of had a closer eye on Cuba in recent weeks as it is. And then this happens. Hal, this statement, again, just coming out within the past hour or two, they're saying these were Cubans living in the United States trying to infiltrate the island and unleash terrorism. What are we to make of what the Cuban government is saying?
Austin, it's really interesting the way they're putting it. And I will tell you, they kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier before this particular statement, when they started naming the individuals involved. They said, well, they're known criminals, and then they used the word terrorism. And I got to put terrorism in a Cuban governmental context. In their minds, the only terrorism that goes on in Cuba is whatever wants to end the Cuban regime, whatever wants to stop the Cuban government from being the current government. That's how they define terrorism. Other than that, Cuba's had a long history of welcoming terrorists, other terrorists, into their country and giving them asylum. So when I heard that, that was immediate red flag in my mind, that they have identified these individuals and they might be anti-regime individuals. They said they're residents of the United States. This does hearken to another age. This was much more common when Castro was in power. And if you go into the 1960s and early 70s, there was a lot of back and forth between Florida and Cuba with groups that were anti-communist, anti-Castro, that wanted to move the regime. We haven't seen much of that since, and Cuba, of course, has opened up its country a little bit more. They had cruise ships and tourists going in there, and we now have formal relations with them, with the U.S. Embassy there. So things have changed a lot in that regard, but this was rather interesting. But I will go to what Secretary Rubio was talking about today. He said, look, they weren't U.S. government personnel, and we're investigating this, and we don't know for sure. And frankly, I think that's the biggest thing, is we're not entirely sure who they were. But a couple things. Number one, the boat was apparently in Cuban territorial waters. So did their Coast Guard have the right to stop that boat? Yes, they did. Legally, international law, absolutely. That is territorial sovereign waters. They could do that. The Cubans are saying that when they tried to stop the personnel on the boat, the crew or whatever, opened fire onto the Cuban vessel, onto the Cuban Coast Guard vessel. If that did happen, under international law, everything there kind of transpired the same way we would handle that if it happened in our waters. All right. So I don't know. I don't know if sometimes Cubans have been known to make stuff up. And so it could be that they didn't open fire. It could be they just took the boat under fire. But then again, we're going to have a little bit difficult time, I think, on the world stage explaining that as well, because if it was in Cuban territorial waters, even if the Cubans took it under fire, if you look at what we're doing in the Caribbean and in the Pacific with other boats, other fast speed boats, they would definitely point a finger at us and say, well, look what you're doing. And I'm sure that would be something that might come back as a recrimination at some point.
It seems that there were 10 people on this boat, 4 of them dead, 6 injured. That means we have 6 survivors. How crucial is their testimony going to be?
I don't know when we're ever going to hear their testimony, to be
Mm.
honest with you. The Cubans have them, and there were 10 on the boat, 6 were wounded, 4 were killed. They've identified, they have the names, or at least they put out the names of those. They say who they are. Whether that's entirely accurate or not, we don't know. But the Cubans have the whole thing right now. I mean, they've got the boat, they have the individuals on the boat, and and basically they are the source of the story. Now, the U.S. Embassy in Cuba is trying to gather as much information as they possibly can. Certainly, Secretary Rubio has expressed a lot of interest, and there's been discussion that the U.S. is going to try and investigate this. That will be a rather difficult situation. As you know, our relations with Cuba are incredibly tense right now. The president has actually talked about the possibility of regime change in Cuba. We're blocking oil from getting to Cuba. Their economy is literally just in tatters right now. They have no oil. Their grid system is pretty much defunct, and they're short on food and everything else. And international aid packages are coming into Cuba to help them out. So it is just a fascinating story at a absolutely crucial time in Cuban history, where the regime may not be around for that much longer.
How does the U.S., and for those who haven't watched us before, Hal Kemper is a retired Marine intelligence officer. How does the U.S. gather intelligence when, if we could say this, the Cuban government perhaps isn't quite as easy to do the intelligence share thing with?
Well, let's go with an idea that they may not be completely forthcoming on this one. All right. But there is a possibility. I don't rule out that if it is kind of what the Cuban government is saying it is, they might actually start sharing information with us, and they might actually do a public show trial with these individuals and say they were planning terrorism or something like that. And we might have to kind of look at what's going on. I don't know that what the Cuban government is saying is completely fabricated or made up or false. There might be an element of truth. And I just have to say, historically speaking, there were anti-Cuban government elements that used to come down on speedboats. It's not that far from the south of Florida into Cuba, and it does definitely fit that profile from everything we're being told. So, but as far as the other ways, the more surreptitious ways that we gather intelligence, well, that's protecting sources and methods, and obviously that's not something. And by the way, if we do that, there might be an intelligence report somewhere on it, but it's never going to be something that becomes a public investigative report on it, because you have to protect the sources and methods of however we gather that information.